title. And basically what he was saying was more or less the same thing you're saying, is that I really fear a mass electorate because the leader of a party now will be in a position, this is before mass media of course, will be in a position to go over the heads of party organizations and party leaders to mobilize mass electorates and use them at his will. And I would prefer Ostrogorski's model. That is, I mean, this is exactly what Trump has done. And I would prefer Ostrogorski's model because he has managed to use media, if you would like, but really Ostrogorski was talking without media, going over the heads of party leaders and mobilizing a mass electorate against his own party structure. Is this dangerous? Damn straight it's dangerous, because to the extent that a mass electorate can be manipulated and not tempered by an organizational structure, I think it really is very dangerous. But I don't think it's infinitely dangerous. It depends on the strength of the institutions that we have in the United States and indeed in France. There are still opposition parties. There is still a network of associations and interest groups that serve as moderating influences and clashing influences. We still live in a society and in a polity in which there are forces who are opposed to what this president would want to do. Imagine for a moment that Trump's speech about his first 100 days would actually come into effect. Would he be any more powerful to put them into effect than Obama was to put programs that were deemed radical by Republicans? Would he be able to put them into effect? I don't think so. I mean, we're dealing in sort of unknown territories here, but I don't think so. Anyway,
Gilles, you want to talk about Marine Le Pen and her? Does she have fascist leanings? Would you trace her back to Action Française or Vichy or any of what we think of as fascist-like movements?
Yeah, if you take the long road, of course,
Yeah.
we all know that the French Front National was born as an extreme right party in the early 70s. That Jean-Marie Le Pen has a long history as part of the French extreme right, and people even like nowadays like Bruno Gollnisch or others have that sort of history. So yes, the FN is an extreme right party, and they used to have fascist groups within the FN, which after they came back. It's a very long history of coming and going for fascist groups within the FN. Now, I think the problem with applies to Donald Trump too is do we need to use the fascist label to describe this party? I mean, what use can we make as political scientists or commentators of French and American politics of using the word fascism, which refers to a very clear period in history. And of course, somebody like Paxton, I think, would agree that fascism has some core features. If you want to talk about fascism, you have to talk about a profoundly anti-democratic movement. And we both know that neither Trump nor Marine Le Pen are anti-democratic people. They claim democracy. Actually, they claim more democracy. They say the one who've taken democracy away from the people are the political parties. We claim direct democracy. We claim referendum. We claim to give the power back to the people. I think we have to be very careful. Another core feature of fascism is the single party. Those people, Trump and Le Pen, they don't claim there will be one party. They're actually quite happy that there are more than one party. But I think we have to be very, very, very careful. Racism is another very strong feature of fascism, and you wouldn't find proper racism in terms of biological racism in neither Trump nor Marine Le Pen. So if we look at, and the role of the military, of course, is another important feature of fascism. So I think if we just look at the definition, the historic definition of fascism, we won't find much evidence that those parties or those political leaders they qualify as fascist. Now, they're not fascist, but I would say for Marine Le Pen that she's very much radical right, and actually that's now the most often in the literature she's described, and now the FN is described. And it's radical right. It's another type of party. and the radical right parties, they're not anti-democratic parties, but they undermine the legitimacy of representative democracy. And that's really what is at stake. Those parties, they undermine the legitimacy of political parties, of interest groups, of trade unions, of courts, of rights, of international treaties and conventions. So I think we have to be very careful because we've had this debate in France for many years. I mean, I remember, to tell you a story, I used to teach on the FN and I had students, and one day I went to one of those FN meetings, and I was with the FN people because I was interviewing them, and my students saw me and they started to say, "You're fascist, you're fascist." And I tried to explain, it's we have to be careful not to use those words because then again, it's very easy for Marine Le Pen and for Donald Trump to say, "Look, we're not fascist." And then again, it will refer to fascism as it was back in Germany in the 30s or in Italy. So I think we have to use the proper labels for those parties. And at least, I don't know, I agree that for Trump, you can use right-wing populism. It's clearly the best, one of the best labels I would use, but I'm not the expert.
I think that, the FN actually has held power. They've held power at the local level. And they've done disturbing things when they've held power at the local level. And so you have something you can actually measure and see. At the local level, it seemed to me that when this occurred in the 1990s, in the late 1990s, that at the local level, where they were able to, they engaged in something approaching the kind of, they often engage in something approaching the kind of thing that Paxton was talking about. The possibility of this happening at the national level is really pretty remote, which is not to say that there are not disturbing things that would happen. If they were in power at the national level in a coalition government in France, presidency in the United States, and you suddenly began to see a disintegration of some of the barriers to moderation, a disintegration of competitive institutional structures, then you can say more accurately that this is possible. It's hard to imagine that the Supreme Court would fall apart if Donald Trump became president, or that in fact he would be able to bully Congress in the way that he bullies the media from time to time. That doesn't seem realistic, certainly not at this point, to contemplate.
Okay, now I'll move it back to the left, my left question, which is, because there's a paradox in both races, and that is, on the American side, that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump have three common subjects that they talk about all the time: free trade, aggressive interventionist foreign policy, and corrupt campaign finance. And you frequently hear people interviewed saying, if I can't vote for Trump, I vote for Sanders. If I can't vote for Sanders, I vote for Trump. I haven't seen any really good polling on it yet. Maybe there has been, but it's in the air. So there's a left-right, maybe I shouldn't call it a left-right convergence, but there's a convergence of what I would consider left-wing populism from Sanders, and more right-wing populism from Trump. Similarly, in France, you have an argument about the euro and national sovereignty, which Le Pen has addressed head-on, and which the putative leader of the left, the authentic left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, is afraid to really address, because he comes out of an old-fashioned socialist, more internationalist tradition, and he's leery about coming right out and hitting the, saying, let's get out of the euro, which allows Marine Le Pen, as I said at the beginning, in some sense, to run to his left. Because there's a lot of out-of-work factory workers in France, like in Ohio, who are angry and feel like their political status has been reduced. So why don't you talk about the populist challenge on the left, or to the left, in relation to Le Pen? And is the left just asleep at the wheel? They're not facing reality, or is there a way that they can address this tactically?
Well, I think the problem with Mélenchon, and you said it yourself, is that he's very much mainstream. I mean, he's a former member of the Socialist Party. And if we look at why people vote for Marine Le Pen and Front National, clearly we find very strong anti-establishment feelings and attitudes. And so far...
And ex-communists
Yeah,
also.
of course, yeah.
Yeah, ex-left-wingers.
And the problem with Mélenchon is that so far he hasn't only tapped into anti-establishment. He's tried to use some populist mobilization, but it's been very very soft compared with Marine Le Pen and the Front National. So that's one thing. The second thing, again, you said it yourself, is that a major issue for FN voters is Euroscepticism. And then again, Marine Le Pen is going all the way because she claims that France should withdraw from the euro and probably from the EU altogether. And Jean-Luc Mélenchon comes from a different perspective, and the whole of the radical left in Europe, and that includes Podemos in Spain or Syriza in Greece. These people are only soft Eurosceptics. I mean, they're very much against the pro-market, EU, but they don't want to be the EU at all. Not even want to be the euro. So that makes another weakness for Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, because he can't really compete with Marine Le Pen because she's more anti-establishment and she's more Eurosceptic. And then the last thing, or two last things maybe, is in the literature there's a very clear evidence now, empirical evidence that when you have in the same country the radical right competing with the radical left, then the radical left does less well. And in fact, if you just look at the political landscape in Europe at the moment, those countries where the radical left is doing pretty well, like Greece, Spain, Portugal, these are countries where, or Italy, where the radical right is either inexistent or very small or very unsuccessful. But when you have a successful radical right party, it's much more difficult for a radical left party to establish itself and become successful. And then one last thing, which I think is extremely important, because it's right that Marine Le Pen, she's taken the Front National very much to the left in the economy. I mean, myself, I show in my work that she's endorsed, very strong economic nationalism and more redistributive policies, and she's pro-welfare state, she's pro-state intervention. I mean, she's very much to the left. And of course, many people in France say, oh, they're just the same. But then again, this is one part of the ideology, but the other part, which is of course very important, is nationalism. Is that Marine Le Pen, she's profoundly, as we know, nationalist, which is anti-immigration, whereas Jean-Luc Mélenchon and the radical left, they come from the internationalist tradition. And Jean-Luc Mélenchon himself is very pro-immigration. And that's why, at the moment in France, he can't be successful because right now the mood in France, the dominant mood is against immigration. And taking very pro-immigration, of course on a very social equality agenda, workers' rights, and whether they're immigrants or nationals. But that really makes things very difficult for Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And when you look at my last comment, when you look at the people who vote for Mélenchon, they're not working class people. They're mostly middle class and upper class public servants like myself, for instance. I'm the ideal Mélenchon voter, but people who think the Socialist Party, they're not left enough in France, and they're too mainstream, too much in the center, or too much social liberal. So the true left is either the small Trotskyites like former Olivier Besancenot or Mélenchon. So that's why right now Mélenchon is doing it's not very successful with the working class, because the working class at the moment in France, they want anti-immigration and redistribution.
Okay, good. And how about on the left here? Because it does seem, contrary to Mélenchon, it's a very important point. He does much better with the gauche caviar than he does with the ex-communist unemployed steelworkers. Sanders seems to be doing pretty well with the disenfranchised white working class, much better than anyone would have expected. He would be more the bourgeois, liberal, social, sort of parlor socialist candidate, and he's really getting a huge number of white working class voters. He's beating Hillary Clinton across the board. So what's the difference between France and America? Why is he doing so well? And what does he share What do Trump and he have in common, and what distinguishes them?
Well, I don't think they have anything in common, and they don't have a common electorate either. I mean, what's been driving.
So you don't agree that trade,
No, I think there are issues.
foreign policy and.
I think there are issues. I mean, there is no way on earth that Sanders would agree with Trump's foreign policy speech, his isolationist foreign policy speech of last week. I think there are issues in foreign policy that, that touch on, there are parts of issues of foreign policy that touch on the same questions. But let me start from where you started, and that is the assumption that Sanders, who has kind of old-fashioned left working class appeal, is getting huge numbers of working class voters. I mean, I tried to check this out when actually Sanders first claimed it. And what I found when I looked at the surveys, and there are very, very few surveys that break down his support by income, is that in fact the few surveys I found that broke down his support by income indicated that he wasn't doing very well among those who earn $50,000 or less, which is to say the mean family income in the United States or less. He may do well in areas in which there are large numbers of working class voters, which he has done from time to time, but he hasn't, there's no indication that I can see that he's actually been doing well among working class voters. The second thing is whether he's drawing from some of the same well springs of discontent. And here I think that this is probably true, but very different people but very different kinds of people are voting for him than are voting for Trump. And I think that his campaign, it's hard to know because the survey's actually been very poor. But I think that his campaign has been very much issue-driven, and he's hammered away at a relatively few number of issues. Particularly, he's hammered away at inequality. And he's hammered away at inequality in a variety of ways. And what he has succeeded in doing is bringing young people who basically never vote, bringing young people into the electorate, into his electorate. And there he's done very well indeed. And in this sense, Mélenchon has actually not done very well. He's not brought huge numbers of young people. And the difference in the analogy, I think, the big difference in the analogy, I think, or the comparison, I think, is the following. Mélenchon is marginal in France. The question of the working class vote in France was settled some years ago. Settled in the sense that working class voters were really voting FN and were voting to some extent socialist, but certainly were not voting, as you said, we're not voting for the far left in France. Now, Sanders is not in any sense marginal. He's done extremely well in the primaries, and he's challenged Hillary Clinton right across the country. And he is an important political figure. And to the extent that he can hold on to his electorate, will have an influence on Democratic priorities going into the presidential election. And there are no major issues, it seems to me, on which there are huge disagreements between him and Hillary Clinton. There are small disagreements, for example, with regard to the minimum wage. There are certainly disagreements with regard to Hillary's votes in the past, but the past is past. There are some disagreements on distributive and redistributive policies that I think have emerged. But because Sanders has not been very specific on the policies he's been proposing, but he's focused on particular policy areas without being specific about it, it's really difficult to pin him down about what he would do. Sanders is not leaving the euro, for example. He's not leaving the EU. We're not talking about big differences in the same as we're talking about big differences in France.
Okay. Exactly 7:32, so now it's time to open it up for other questions. Right there.
If you look beyond 2015 for the presidential election, it seems that the FN has two different forms. The northern guys have sort of a very leftist economic policies, but in the south we have Marion Le Pen, which as far as I'm concerned is the most attractive woman I've seen in a long time, and by far the smartest I ever met, which is very more conservative in terms of economics. Will that lead to a split in the party?
I presume you're asking Gilles.
It might, yeah.
Yeah.
It will very much depend on how well the FN does in the presidential and legislatives. Because we know that, in the FN, factionalism has always been there. It's endemic. It's a problem with the party since it was created. So right now, the glue that brings all those people, keep those people together is electoral success. The FN is doing pretty well. Much better than it's ever done in the past. So yeah, maybe it could be I don't think a party split, but there might be more internal turmoil after the elections. But the other thing is right now, Marine Le Pen, she's the uncontested leader right now. For another good few years. So it's more like a second-tier factional rivalry between people like Philippot and Marion Maréchal. I think right now we are at that stage in the history of the party where Marine Le Pen is the leader for another good few years, I think. Even if she doesn't do very well in 2017, I suspect they will have a few more MPs. She will do well in the presidential, so that should keep the party going for another few years. But then at lower tier, yeah, would be more instability.
It raises an interesting question, the question that you asked, because the previous period that the party was doing very well, which is the end of the 90s, particularly in the 1998 regional election, the result of doing well, because there was real stuff at stake, was a split in the party. This was the time where Bruno Magret, for example, broke away. I'm wondering whether success breeds a kind of continuity of leadership, or success raises the stakes in this sense would perhaps provoke a split in the party.
Well, I don't see that happening. Right now I don't see why the party would split, because the difference between the difference between the North and the South, I think, is overrated. Because where people forget that there are other issues. The difference between the North and the South is not that big in the end. I think when you look at the electorate, they're pretty much the same electorates, and they're pretty much the same factors. For instance, people forget that PACA, the southern region, is one of the poorest regions in France, for instance.
North and South, the two candidates inside the FN, not the electorate. But their policies are so different in terms of economics. That makes Marion very electable, in my view, for a lot of positions. And in fact, she's the only member of parliament of the FN in France, okay? No, the other one is affiliated. He's not an FN member. They have 30% of the vote and one deputy. How to rig an election?
Yeah, but then again, she's electable, but so is Marine Le Pen. So right now, I don't see why Marion Maréchal would, try to split the party. She has no incentive to do so. She's very happy within the FN. What is happening at the moment that the FN, as a party, is redefining its economic policies, because they've understood from the regional elections that the leftist orientation is not working anymore. That if they want to really get into the conservative vote and people on the right in France, they need to shift the agenda, their economic agenda, towards the right. And that's what they're going to do for the presidential election, one way or another. But that's just policy shifts. We're not talking about creating another party I wouldn't say we are very far from the situation of the 90s and the strong internal dispute between Le Pen and Maigret, which led to the split in the party. I think we are very far. I might be wrong, but I think we are very far from that. But yeah, they have to work out a more coherent economic policy.
Yes.
Question for Gilles again. Omar, if you can, sorry.
That's great, yeah.
Comment. Yeah. I'm wondering if you can comment on young voters and the FN, and because it seems to me that 20 years ago, young voters were really ashamed to vote FN, but I wonder if it's an impression that they're much more relaxed about voting FN now, and if that's true, what that means for the future of the FN in 10 or 20 years from now.
Well, I think there are two things here, two different types of factors. I think The first thing is, yeah, young voters, they're more prone to vote for the FN now. And probably this has to do with the whole dehumanization. Clearly Marine Le Pen is more against more modern and some social issues such as abortion. So that's clearly something which helps young voters to turn to the FN. But now we have to be very careful because when we say young voters, we tend to think of the youth as a very homogeneous group, and they're not. And actually, when you look at surveys and you do the breakdown for the FN electorate, and especially the young electorate, you find that it's only one type of young people that vote for the FN, and mostly those with very low education. And actually the FN right now is successful among young voters who are unemployed. And as you know, unemployment in France for the young people is about 25%, so it's quite high. And it makes quite a large reservoir for the FN. So there's lots of young people who are more educated, who've been traveling a lot in Europe with Erasmus, for instance. They're more Europhile, they're open, they're not nationalist, they're not culturally exclusive. So young people who vote for the FN, there are one type of young people. There's also another type of young people who don't vote for the FN. So it's a more heterogeneous category.
In back there?
Yeah, I had a question for Martin. I really appreciated your remarks. Felt they were spot on. I've been involved in the Bernie Sanders campaign, but there's one area that I would beg to differ with you on. And that was you kind of minimize the differences between Hillary and Bernie. And I know within the Bernie Sanders campaign, there's a vigorous debate now about whether or not he should, run on the Green Party ticket and form a new left party in the U.S. So I wanted to get your thoughts about that. And there is, there's some group that the Sanders campaign would actually, if they had the choice between Hillary and Trump, they would actually prefer Trump, not because they support Trump, but rather because they'd rather see him be in office for 4 years and then elect, a real liberal.
You mean like back in 1930s Germany?
Right.
We'd elect.
Or because if you elect Hillary, she's going to presumably be the Democratic candidate for the next, not only this election, but then the next election in 2020. So they, there's some people that say, I think Susan Sarandon alluded to that in an interview when she said, I would prefer to just have Trump rather than Hillary for that very reason.
Yeah, it's been around. On one hand, I really appreciated your remarks. In some ways, they confirm what the Pew survey was indicating, and that is that the more involved you are in politics, the more you tend to see differences rather than commonalities increasingly in the United States. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, I think it's both. I mean, certainly the people who've been involved, like you, who've been involved in the Sanders campaign, understand the differences much more profoundly than people who have not been involved in the campaign. But let me ask you, I'm not going to throw this question back at you, but it's really a hypothetical question. Are the differences as great as you presume they are? And if they are as great, I mean, this remark by Susan Sarandon really captures it. If they are as great, then nothing else matters. But clearly, I don't think they are. And I think when you begin to analyze the differences in the campaign proposals, not so much the rhetoric, but the campaign proposals, these are relatively small differences in terms of public policy. I mean, Bernie Sanders is in favor of a single-payer system for health. The people in the Hillary campaign says he wants to scuttle Obamacare. Both, in fact, may be right in a sense, but both of them, both candidates are in favor of a national healthcare system, that would be more or less universal. I can't see how far you can go with this, with what you said, unless there is sufficient, unless there's, in addition to the policy differences, there's anger driving those differences.
I'd like to ask Gilles, how is Sanders viewed in France, in your circle?
I don't don't think French people follow much the campaign on the left side. I'm sorry. I think they're more interested in Trump at the moment. But it's I don't know actually.
You don't know. And Trump, are people just conventionally horrified, or is there a more sophisticated analysis?
They are both. I think most people are horrified, and they now tend to turn to more sophisticated analysis to understand why the phenomenon is so, so deep and why it's working. Because I think, like in the U.S., maybe people have sort of underestimated Trump. Maybe it was just, whatever people would describe him like, and now he seems to be very clever and very strategic politician. He is a politician, clearly. So now people in front, they look at him and try to understand what he's doing. And of course, how he's going to turn his popularity into something more acceptable in general election.
You want to say?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's very striking about Trump is not just his popularity, but his impopularity. I mean, both are very, very strong, and both are very typical of the leadership of the FN, who have both. And one of the things we haven't talked about here is what it means when a person who has gained ascendancy by winning popular votes now gets the use of a national political machine, and therefore can not only transform those votes into more votes, but also has a machine for doing that, if he can really capture that machine. And I think one of the issues for Trump is the extent to which he can capture that machine, or whether people sit on their hands, and whether big donors, such as one of the Koch brothers, for example, said that he tends to give money to Hillary. I mean, that can happen as well, but I think that's what's in question now, is not his popularity, but the machine.
May I just add a few words
Sure,
about this?
but yes.
It's interesting what Martin is talking about, because that reminds me that if you look at Europe, for instance, and radical right parties which have been in power, or which are in power in Europe, most of them, I think, they've used existing political organizations. I was just thinking, the FPÖ in Austria, which, as you know, is about maybe to win the presidency, was actually a small liberal party in the 50s before Jörg Haider in the 80s turned it into a radical right party. I'm thinking, of course, the Swiss example we just discussed before the conference, and the Swiss party, which Blocher has turned into a radical right party, was a party of government in Switzerland traditionally. And there are other examples, like in Finland or other countries, where actually populist leaders took an existing political organization to get into power. So maybe that's what Trump is doing here in the US, using the existing Republican Party to get into power, to get populism into power, which is very different from, for instance, creating a brand new populist organization that will compete with existing parties. I think Ross Perot, for instance, many years ago in the US tried that and it didn't work very well.
Right, that doesn't work. This is in
So
some
maybe
ways
that's
a unique
interesting.
phenomenon.
Right there, wait,
I'd
who's
like to-
first? You were
Yeah.
first.
I'd like to ask a question about authoritarianism. I won't say it again, but there are a couple of very interesting articles this last few months here, saying that it was the single most important factor, predicting factor about Trump supporters, that they are rated very high when you test for authoritarianism tendencies. And as a French person living here, it was really depressing for me, because the idea, I remember a year ago, there was a poll in France saying that 70% of the French people said what we need is a strong man. And I had this idea up to a few months ago that really American society was immune to that. That, Tocqueville and all of that. There was not American tendencies, that the authoritarianism was not something that was part of the political patrimony or political history of this country. So does that mean that, of course, maybe Donald Trump is a strong man, and that's his main appeal for most of the electorate, most of his supporters? Does it mean that he killed Tocqueville again, or it's just all right?
No, I don't. I think Tocqueville is alive and well for the moment. But I would bring you back to that Quinnipiac poll that was published last month, it was, the question that was asked was, what we need is a leader who is willing to say or do anything to South America's problems. And we're dealing with 84% of Trump supporters who either agree, very much agree, or somewhat agree with this statement. There are other questions in that poll, but there's a consistency about it. The reason why I got so attached to this question, I focus on it so much, is that there were surveys that were done back in the late 50s, particularly during the McCarthy period in the United States, where social scientists were differentiating between the attitudes of political leaders and the attitudes of mass publics. And what they found was that, there was one question in those surveys in the 50s that was very similar to that. And what they found then was that there was what they considered to be very large support among mass publics, which is to say 35%, and very small support among political elites, which is to say 10 to 15%. Social scientists were so upset by the kind of positive response that they got to these kinds of authoritarian questions that they began to develop formulas about mass publics that were authoritarian and could not be trusted. And when they analyzed the roots of support for whom? For Joseph McCarthy at the time, what they found was they found this authoritarian public that was supporting Joe McCarthy, and that the country was only saved by non-authoritarian elites. So what do you do when, in some sense, this is reversed? You know, you have mass support that can be gauged as authoritarian, both among mass publics, strongly supported by a certain set of political elites. I think it's very, very troubling. And it's not something that is conjunctural. There's something structural about it, because you can see it